Do not hit her again. In this house, people have been buried for far less. Angela Morse is standing over the future queen of the syndicate. Her right hand is rigid, the skin across her knuckles white and humming with the shock of the impact. She isn't breathing, she's vibrating. She isn't afraid of the woman bleeding on the marble. She's terrified of the monster she just woke up inside herself. She just crossed a line that, in the world of the Lee Syndicate, usually ends in a shallow grave. The woman on the floor is Ina. She is wearing a soft pink silk dress that costs more than Angela's hometown. Her hand is hovering over her cheek, her eyes wide, not with physical pain, but with the pure, venomous shock that a servant dared to touch a god. Behind Angela sits a wheelchair. In it, Mrs. Kim, 71 years old, her silver hair perfectly braided, her glasses crooked. Her left cheek is a map of violence, a fresh, angry handprint. The glass door slides open. Lee Chae-yong walks in, his gray suit tailored to hide the holster at his hip. He stops. He sees his crying fiancée, his motionless maid, and his mother with a bruised face. 3 people. 3 versions of the truth. And 10 seconds before someone dies. 6 months ago, Angela Morse arrived in Seoul with a social work degree she couldn't use and a need to disappear. She took a job as a maid because she thought rules would keep her safe. She thought if she just kept her head down and her apron white, the world couldn't hurt her again. Today, she realized that some people don't deserve her silence. Thank you for coming to the Cinem Corner channel. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe, and share. There is always a story for you. Let's go. The elevator didn't just ascend, it pressurized. By the time the doors slid open on the 55th floor, the air felt thin, scrubbed clean by industrial filters and the cold smell of expensive floor wax. Angela Morse adjusted the collar of her black uniform, the starch scratching against her neck like a warning. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of glass and silence. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Choi whose face was as immobile as the marble beneath their feet, didn't offer a tour. She offered a set of boundaries. Her heels clicked a rhythmic, hollow beat against the white stone as she led Angela through the sprawling open-concept living area. To the left, a wall of glass looked out over a soul that seemed toy-sized and powerless from this height. To the right, shadows pooled in the corners of rooms filled with art that looked like it belonged in a museum. Cold, sharp, and untouchable. Everything in the penthouse felt designed to remind you of your own insignificance. The ceilings were too high, the furniture too angular. But beneath the architectural perfection, Angela felt the undercurrent she had spent her life learning to read. It was in the way a man in a dark suit stood motionless by the balcony, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracking Angela's reflection in the glass rather than the woman herself. It was the slight, metallic click of a heavy door locking in the distance. This was a place where wealth was a weapon and privacy was a form of paranoia. "You are here for the madam," Mrs. Choi said, her voice a low vibration that barely carried. "You are not here for the business. You do not look at the guests. You do not speak to the guards. And you certainly do not wander into the master's study." They passed a long mahogany table where a single heavy glass of whiskey sat sweating on a coaster. Beside it lay a gold-plated lighter and a folded newspaper, perfectly aligned. The precision was suffocating. Angela realized then that in this house, a stray hair or a crooked picture frame wasn't a mistake. It was a security breach. She thought of her small guest house room, the one with the peeling wallpaper where she had ironed this uniform on the floor. She had come to Korea to be invisible, to let the structure of a rigid society hide the jagged edges of her own past. But as she followed Mrs. Choi toward the east wing, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She had traded one kind of chaos for a much more organized, lethal variety. They reached a heavy oak door at the end of a long, sun-drenched corridor. Mrs. Choi paused, her hand hovering over the handle. Madam Kim does not like noise. She does not like pity. She is a woman who once commanded thousands. Remember that before you offer her your help. The door swung open, and the scent changed. Gone was the sterile, metallic air of the penthouse. Here, it smelled of old paper, dried lilies, and the faint, bitter tang of medicinal tea. In the center of the room, framed by the dying amber light of the afternoon sun, sat the woman in the wheelchair. Mrs. Kim didn't turn. She remained staring at the Ensol Tower in the distance, her silver braid a shimmering cord against her red blouse. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the hallway. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. Angela took a breath, stepped over the threshold, and felt the heavy door click shut behind her, sealing her inside the lion's den. Mrs. Kim didn't move when Angela approached. She sat with the absolute stillness of a statue, her gaze fixed on the sprawling city below as if she were trying to burn a hole through the glass with her eyes alone. The red of her blouse was the only warmth in the room, a defiant splash of color against the sterile white walls and the cold chrome of the wheelchair. "I'm Angela," she said softly, keeping her distance. She didn't lead with a smile. She knew better. In a house where everyone performed a role, a forced smile was just another lie. The silver-haired woman finally turned her head. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. Behind her thin-framed glasses, Mrs. Kim's eyes were a startling, sharp dark, not the clouded eyes of the confused woman the housekeeper had described, but the eyes of a general surveying a battlefield from a position of forced retreat. She looked at Angela's black uniform, then up to her face, searching for the crack in the armor. "You're late with the tea," Mrs. Kim said. Her voice wasn't weak. It was a low, rasping command, the sound of a blade that hadn't been sharpened in years but could still draw blood. "I haven't been given the tea yet, madam. I was told I should meet you first." Mrs. Kim let out a sound that might have been a laugh if there were any joy left in her. "They told you I was a duty. They told you I was fating. That is why they sent a girl who looks like she has spent her life holding up things that want to fall." Angela felt the observation hit home. She looked at Mrs. Kim's hands, resting on the armrests. They were small, the skin like translucent parchment, but her grip was tight, white-knuckled. It wasn't a grip for stability. It was a grip of suppressed rage. Angela stepped closer, noticing the way the wheelchair was positioned. It was angled just slightly too far from the bookshelf, and the remote for the curtains had been placed on a side table just 6 inches beyond the reach of a paralyzed woman's arm. It wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. "You aren't fading," Angela said, her voice dropping to a steady, quiet frequency. "You're being muted." The sharp eyes flickered. For a second, the mask of the Empress slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, jagged recognition. Mrs. Kim looked at the remote, then back at Angela. "In this family, silence is survival. My son thinks he is protecting me by keeping me in this cage. His fiancée thinks she is winning by keeping the cage locked." "And what do you think?" Angela asked. Mrs. Kim leaned back, her posture regaining its rigid, commanding height despite the chair. "I think that for 3 years, I have been a ghost in my own hallways. I think that people see the chair and they stop seeing the woman. They talk over me as if I am furniture. They decide my meals, my clothes, and my thoughts." She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the silk of her own sleeve. "But ghosts can be very patient, Angela. And they see everything." Angela looked around the room. The books she couldn't reach, the window she couldn't open, the door that only opened from the outside. The realization settled in her gut like lead. This wasn't a suite. It was a high-altitude cell. Mrs. Kim wasn't just a patient. She was a political prisoner held by the very people who claimed to love her. Angela reached out and moved the remote 6 inches to the left, placing it firmly under Mrs. Kim's hand. The old woman's fingers closed around it. She didn't say thank you. She simply looked at Angela with a gaze that said the war had finally found its second soldier. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of roasted duck and the cloying, sweet perfume Ina wore like a second skin. It was a formal dinner, a family gathering that felt more like a court summons. Lee Cha-young sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his silence a heavy weight that kept the bodyguards stationed by the doors in a state of perpetual tension. Angela stood in the shadows of the sideboard, her hands clasped, her eyes trained on the floor. Mrs. Kim sat to Cha-young's right, her silver hair shimmering under the chandelier. She had been quiet all evening, her sharp eyes following the movement of the wine being poured. Ina sat opposite her, draped in a cream-colored silk that looked like liquid moonlight. She was laughing at something Cha-young had said, a bright, melodic sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Ao manam," Ina said, her voice dripping with performative affection. "You haven't touched your tea." is a special blend I brought back from Jeju. It's meant to help with memory. Mrs. Kim didn't blink. My memory is quite intact, Ina. It's my patience that is fraying. Ina's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. She stood up, smoothing her dress. Let me help you. The cup is a bit heavy for your hands today, isn't it? As Ina leaned over Mrs. Kim, her movements were graceful, choreographed for Chayoung's benefit. But Angela, watching from the periphery, saw the shift. Ina's elbow accidentally brushed against the heavy crystal carafe of red wine. In the same heartbeat, as the wine began to tip, Ina's other hand, the one supposedly helping Mrs. Kim with the steaming tea, tilted the cup inward. The wine crashed onto the white tablecloth, a jagged bloom of deep crimson that looked like a fresh wound. In the chaos of the spill, the scalding tea poured directly onto Mrs. Kim's lap. The old woman didn't scream. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her body jerking against the restraints of the wheelchair. Oh, heavens! Ina cried out, her hands flying to her face in a perfect mask of horror. The wine! I'm so clumsy. Chayoung, I was just trying to reach for her. Chayoung was on his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the marble. Angela, get the kit. Now! Angela moved before he finished the sentence. She reached Mrs. Kim first, kneeling on the sodden carpet. The tea was soaking through the red blouse, the heat radiating off the fabric. When Angela looked up, she caught Ina's gaze. For a split second, the mask was gone. Ina wasn't looking at the spill. She was looking at Mrs. Kim's shaking hands with a cold, flickering satisfaction. It was the wine, Ina whispered, her voice trembling with fake tears as she looked at Chayoung. The bottle slipped, and it must have knocked the tea. It happened so fast. Chayoung looked at Angela, his jaw set, his eyes searching for a target for his rage. Is that what happened? Did the carafe hit the cup? Angela felt the heat of the tea on her own fingers as she began to dab at Mrs. Kim's leg with a cold cloth. She felt Mrs. Kim's hands settle on her shoulder. A sharp, digging pressure. A warning. Don't start the war today. We aren't ready. Angela looked at the red wine staining the white linen, then up at the Mafia boss. She felt the weight of the lie like a stone in her throat. Yes, sir, Angela said, her voice flat and disciplined. The carafe slipped. It was an accident. Ina let out a soft, relieved sob, leaning into Chayoung's side. Beneath the table, Mrs. Kim's grip on Angela's shoulder relaxed, but as Angela looked down, she saw a single drop of blood where Mrs. Kim's nail had pierced her own palm in the struggle to remain silent. The red wine had covered the tea, but Angela knew the difference between a spill and a burn. The first blood had been drawn, and for the first time, Angela realized that to save the Empress, she would have to learn how to lie to the king. The smell of antiseptic from Mrs. Kim's burn was still heavy in Angela's nostrils when the penthouse transformed into a stage for the Lee Syndicate's monthly gala. The scorched tablecloth had been replaced by black silk, and the air was now thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of chilled caviar. Angela moved through the crowd like a shadow, carrying trays of crystal flutes, watching the hierarchy of the underworld play out in the glint of cufflinks and the sharp tilt of heads. At the center of it all was Ina. She had changed into a gown of shimmering silver scales that made her look like a siren among sharks. She moved between the high-ranking captains and their wives, her laughter ringing out like a silver bell. To the guests, she was the perfect consort, warm, attentive, and deeply devoted to the woman in the wheelchair. She's been so fragile lately, Angela heard Ina murmur to the wife of a high-ranking lieutenant, her hand resting tenderly on the back of Mrs. Kim's chair. I spend every hour I can just trying to keep her comfortable. It's a tragedy. Really, the way her mind is slipping. Angela watched the guests nod in sympathy, their eyes glassing over with pity as they looked at Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim remained silent, her face a mask of dignified vacancy, but Angela saw the way her eyes tracked the reflection of the bodyguards in the window. The performance was flawless. Ina wasn't just lying to Chayoung. She was curated, public-facing, and lethal. She was building a narrative of a dying woman and a saintly daughter-in-law, a story that would make the eventual erasure of Mrs. Kim seem like an act of mercy. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, after the last guest had departed and the penthouse was reclaimed by a heavy, exhausted silence, that the mask fell away. Angela went to the east wing to prepare Mrs. Kim for bed. The room was dark, save for a single amber lamp. Chaeyong was in his study, the low rumble of his voice through the walls indicating a late-night business call. Angela moved to help Mrs. Kim out of the red blouse she had worn all evening, the one that had hidden the tea burn. As Angela peeled back the silk, she stopped. Her breath hitched in the back of her throat. The burn from the tea was there, a raw, angry patch of red on her thigh, but it wasn't the only mark. On the undersides of Mrs. Kim's upper arms, where the sleeves of the blouse had been tight, were 3 distinct purple bruises. They were perfectly circular, the unmistakable shape of fingertips pressed with terrifying force into soft flesh. These weren't from a fall. They were from a grab, the kind used to hold someone still while you whispered threats into their ear. Angela looked at the marks, then up at Mrs. Kim. The old woman was staring at the bruises with a terrifying detachment, as if her body were merely a piece of property she no longer owned. She did this while the music was playing, Mrs. Kim whispered, her voice so thin it barely disturbed the air. She leaned down to fix my hair. She told me that if I made a sound during the toast, she would make sure my son never saw me again. She squeezed until she felt the bone. Angela's hands shook as she reached for the cooling salve. The reality of the house hit her with a fresh, cold wave of dread. Outside, the world saw the Mafia's code of honor and Ione's choreographed grace. But here, in the dark, the truth was written in purple on a woman's skin. Angela realized then that she wasn't just a maid in a lion's den. She was an eyewitness to a slow-motion execution. And in the Lee Syndicate, witnesses were the first to be buried. The bruises stayed behind Angela's eyelids even when she closed them. Sleep was impossible in a house where the walls seemed to have ears and the shadows felt heavy with the weight of unpaid debts. 2 nights after the gala, while a sudden spring storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Angela found herself in the service corridor near the laundry room. The penthouse was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that preceded a strike. A flickering light caught her eye from the small storage room tucked behind the main pantry, a space used for silver polish and seasonal linens. The door was ajar. Angela moved with the practiced, silent gait of someone who had spent months learning which floorboards groaned. Inside, she found Ione's designer handbag abandoned on a folding chair, and beside it, a stack of leather-bound ledgers that looked out of place among the cleaning supplies. Angela knew she should turn back. In the Lee Syndicate, curiosity didn't just kill the cat. It got the cat's entire lineage erased. But she thought of the purple marks on Mrs. Kim's arms and the way Ina had smiled while the tea scalded the old woman's skin. Angela reached for the top ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was a secondary set of books, written in a cramped, hurried script. Angela's background in social work had required her to manage budgets for underfunded shelters, and she knew how to spot a leak in a financial pipe. As she flipped through the pages, the noir-cold reality of the scheme crystallized. Ina wasn't just a cruel socialite. She was a thief stealing from the devil himself. Small, consistent amounts had been skimmed from the syndicate's legitimate shipping ventures over the last 18 months. The money wasn't being spent on diamonds or silver-scaled gowns. Every cent was tracked to a private entity labeled the Morningcom Pavilion. Angela pulled her phone from her apron pocket, her hands slick with sweat, and searched the name. It wasn't a luxury spa or a retirement resort. It was a high-security psychiatric facility in a remote province, a place known for its discretion and its permanent residents. The website featured sterile white rooms and heavy-duty locks. The most recent entry in the ledger was dated 3 days ago. It was a down payment, a massive sum to secure a private wing for a patient requiring total isolation and cognitive management. The move-in date was marked with a red circle, the day after the wedding. Ina wasn't just trying to break Mrs. Kim's spirit. She was buying her a tomb. The private facility was a place where Mrs. Kim would be drugged into the dementia Ina had spent months faking for the public. Once Mrs. Kim was locked away, Ina would have unfettered access to the family trust and the ear of a mafia boss who would be too heartbroken by his mother's decline to notice his wife was holding the leash. A floorboard creaked in the pantry. Angela froze, the ledger heavy as lead in her hands. She shoved the book back onto the shelf and retreated into the darkness of the laundry room just as a shadow passed the door. Heart hammering against her ribs, Angela realized the stakes had shifted again. This wasn't just about a daughter-in-law's cruelty anymore. This was a hostile takeover. Ina was building a cage, and the bars were already being forged. Angela looked at her strong hands in the dim light. She was no longer just a maid or a witness. She was the only thing standing between the Empress and an erased life. The smell of rain and ozone still clung to the glass as Angela made her way back to the East Wing, the weight of the hidden ledger pressing into her mind like a physical bruise. The penthouse felt colder than usual, a vast, hollow shell of marble and shadow. She reached the threshold of the long corridor, but the path was blocked. Lee Chae-yong was standing in the darkness of the hall, his back to the windows where lightning occasionally illuminated the sharp silhouette of his suit. He wasn't moving. He didn't have a glass of whiskey or a phone. He was simply waiting. The predator had finally stepped out from the study and into the light. "You spend a lot of time in her room, Angela," he said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Angela stopped, her posture instinctively rigid, her hands clasped at the waist of her apron. "She is my assignment, sir. I'm ensuring she is comfortable." Chae-yong stepped forward, the amber light of a wall sconce catching the cold, unreadable depths of his eyes. He didn't look like a grieving son. He looked like a man who had spent his life deciding who lived and who was erased. Comfort is a relative term. In this house, people are comfortable when they follow the rules, when they stay within the lines drawn for them. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic, perhaps the oil on the weapon at his hip, filling her senses. "I've noticed the way you look at my fiancé. I've noticed the way my mother looks at you. There's a look of understanding. That concerns me. I only wish to serve your family, sir," Angela replied, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Loyalty is a simple concept in the syndicate, Angela. It is a straight line. You serve me by serving my house. And in this house, Ina's word is the law." He leaned in closer, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "My mother is a relic of a time that is ending. She is fragile. Her mind is a broken thing. If you are filling her head with delusions, or if you are entertaining the idea that you know better than the woman who will soon carry the Lee name, that is not loyalty. That is a mutation." Angela felt the air leave her lungs. He wasn't just defending his fiancée. He was warning her that any deviation from the narrative Ina had crafted would be seen as a declaration of war. "I understand, sir," she whispered. Chae-yong reached out, his hand hovering near her throat for a terrifying second before he adjusted the stiff white collar of her uniform with clinical precision. "Do you? Because maids in this city are easy to find. But maids who know too much, who think too much, they are hard to keep. And I don't like keeping things that have outlived their utility." He stepped back into the shadows, his presence still a heavy, suffocating weight. "Go to her. Clean her room. Braid her hair. But remember, Angela, once the wedding is done, the structure of this house will be absolute. Make sure you're on the right side of the door when it locks." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the marble. Angela remained in the dark, her skin crawling. The stakes were no longer about a visa or a paycheck. Chae-yong had just drawn a circle around her and his mother, and the circle was shrinking. The Mafia's code was clear. You are either an instrument of the boss, or you are an obstacle to be cleared. As she pushed open the door to Mrs. Kim's room, Angela knew the time for hiding ledgers was over. The wedding was coming, and with it, the permanent silence of the morning calm pavilion. The afternoon sun hung low over the Han River, bleeding a bruised orange light across the penthouse floor that made the white marble look like a sheet of ice. Inside the East Wing, the silence didn't just feel heavy. It felt combustible. Angela was adjusting the books on the lower shelf when the door swung open with a violent click. Ina marched in, her pink silk dress rustling with a sharp, agitated sound. She didn't see Angela in the corner. Her eyes were locked on the woman in the wheelchair. "I heard him," Ina hissed, her voice stripped of its melodic public mask. "He sat with you for an hour last night. He was asking about the car accident again. He was asking about the brakes." Mrs. Kim didn't flinch. She sat with her silver braid draped over her shoulder, her gaze level and freezing. "Perhaps he is tired of the stories you tell him, Ina. Perhaps he is starting to remember that his mother was never a fool. Ayane's face contorted, the refined socialite vanishing to reveal the predator beneath. It doesn't matter what he remembers. The papers for the pavilion are signed. Tomorrow you become a ghost for good. She stepped into Mrs. Kim's personal space, her hand darting out to grab the old woman's chin, forcing her to look up. You should have stayed silent, you old hag. Now, I'm going to make sure your final years are a blur of white walls and Thorazine. Mrs. Kim tried to pull away, her small hands gripping the armrests of her chair, but Ina squeezed harder, her nails digging into the fine lines of the Empress's jaw. Don't you dare look away from me. Then came the sound, a sharp, stinging crack that echoed off the high ceilings. Ina's open palm connected with Mrs. Kim's face, a blow so fueled by desperation and rage that it knocked the thin-framed glasses from the old woman's nose. They skittered across the marble, one lens spiderwebbing into 1,000 tiny fractures. Angela didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk to her visa, her life, or her future. The hypervigilance that had kept her head down for months suddenly inverted, turning into a singular, explosive focus. The memory of her own grandmother, of every vulnerable person she had ever held up, surged into her limbs. She crossed the room in 3 strides. Ina had her hand raised again, her face a mask of blind cruelty, when Angela's hand, strong, disciplined, and heavy with months of suppressed outrage, intercepted the arc. Angela didn't use a fist. She used the flat of her palm, a corrective, thunderous strike that caught Ina squarely across the cheek. The impact sent Ina staggering back. Her heels lost their grip on the polished stone, and she collapsed sideways, her pink dress pooling around her like a wilted flower. The silence that followed was deafening. Angela stood center stage, her uniform immaculate, her right hand humming with the ghost of the hit. She planted herself directly between the wheelchair and the woman on the floor. Ina looked up, her hand pressed to her reddening face, her eyes wide with a shock so profound she forgot to scream. For the first time, she wasn't the director of the scene. She was a witness to an insurrection. Do not, Angela said, her voice a low, terrifying vibration that belonged to a woman who was no longer afraid to die. Touch her again. Behind her, Mrs. Kim sat upright, her face marked by the red handprint, but her eyes were fixed on Angela's back with a look of fierce, newfound pride. The door clicked open. Lee Chae-yong stood in the threshold, his gray suit catching the dying light, his eyes taking in the ruin of his fiancée and the defiance of his maid. The 10 seconds had begun. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the sterile quiet of a museum. It was the suffocating pressure of a tomb. Lee Chae-yong didn't rush to the floor to help Ina, nor did he draw the weapon at his hip. He simply stood, a gray ghost in the doorway, his eyes tracing the red handprint on his mother's face before settling on the fractured glasses near Angela's feet. Chae-yong? Ina gasped from the floor, her voice instantly shifting into a jagged, trembling sob. She's insane. She attacked me. I was just trying to help your mother. And she... Be quiet, Ina, Mrs. Kim said. The voice didn't come from a victim. It was the clear, resonant tone of the professor who had once commanded lecture halls, the matriarch who had built the very foundation Chae-yong stood upon. She didn't look at the woman on the floor. She looked directly at her son. Angela did what you have been too blind to do for 3 years, Mrs. Kim continued, her hand rising to touch the bruised heat of her cheek. She stood between me and a monster. Chae-yong took a step into the room, his shadow lengthening across the marble. Mother, you're upset. You aren't seeing things clearly. I have never seen more clearly, she replied, her voice gaining a terrifying, rhythmic strength. For 3 years, I let you believe the car accident was an act of God. I let you believe the brakes failed because of age, because of fate. I sat in this chair and absorbed the guilt you projected onto me, watching you marry the woman who stole my legs. Anne's face went from flushed to a ghostly, translucent white. You don't know what you're talking about. You're confused, the doctor said. The doctors you paid, Ina? Or the facility you bought with my son's money? Mrs. Kim's eyes remained locked on Chae-yong. The morning of the accident, I saw her. I saw her in the garage with a man from her father's firm. I didn't understand then why she was near the undercarriage. I thought she was leaving a gift for your stepfather. I was the fool. I was the one who told him the car felt fine when we started the engine. Angela felt the temperature in the room drop. The lion wasn't just watching now. He was beginning to hunt. Cha-Young's gaze drifted to Ina, who was now trembling with a genuine cold terror. 3 years, Mrs. Kim whispered, the silver braid on her shoulder trembling. 3 years of her whispering in my ear that I killed him, that it was my fault he died and I lived. She used my grief to build a cage, and she used your love to keep the door locked. She didn't want me dead, Cha-Young. She wanted me erased. She wanted the trust transferred to her name while I stared at a white wall in a provincial asylum. Mrs. Kim leaned forward in the chair, her posture so commanding that she seemed to rise above the chrome and wheels. She struck me today because she knew the maid had found the ledgers. She struck me because for the first time in 3 years, I didn't look down when she entered the room. She reached out, her small, parchment-thin hand finding Angela's. The grip was no longer a warning. It was a seal. Today, the silence ends. Either you believe the woman who gave you life, or you believe the woman who tried to steal it. Cha-Young looked at the fractured lens on the floor, then back at Ina. The 10 seconds were over. The truth had finally become the loudest thing in the room. The penthouse windows reflected a city that had transitioned into a deep, electric indigo. But inside, the light was as cold as a blade. Lee Cha-Young didn't shout. He didn't have to. He looked at Ina, still huddled on the marble, and the silence he projected was more terrifying than any threat. It was the silence of a man who had realized he had been played for a fool in his own castle. The Morning Calm Pavilion, Cha-Young said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the bruised cheek of his mother, then at the ledger Angela had placed on the obsidian table. You bought a cage for the woman who built this empire. Ina tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the performance was dead. There were no more tears left that could save her. Cha-Young raised a single hand, a sharp, minimal gesture. 2 men in dark suits appeared from the shadows of the corridor as if the walls themselves had birthed them. They didn't touch her roughly. They simply stood over her, an inescapable physical fact. Take her to the basement, Cha-Young commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. And call her father. Tell him the merger is cancelled. Tell him the debt he owes for the accident 3 years ago will be paid in blood, or in every asset he owns. He has until sunrise to choose. As the guards hoisted Ina up, her pink silk dress rustling one last time in that house of secrets, she looked at Angela. There was no more hate in her eyes, only the hollow, translucent fear of someone who had finally met a power she couldn't charm. The doors slid shut behind them, and the penthouse felt, for the first time, as though it could breathe. Cha-Young turned to the wheelchair. He knelt, not with the practiced, distant duty he had shown before, but with a heavy, grounding humility. He took his mother's hands in his. I was blind, Ayama. I treated you like a memory because it was easier than seeing the pain. Mrs. Kim reached out, her fingers tracing the jawline of the man she had raised to be a king. Fear makes people move, Cha-Young, but respect makes them stand. You confused the two. She looked past him, her sharp gaze settling on Angela, who remained standing by the bookshelf, her hands no longer clasped, her posture a quiet, unyielding pillar. She didn't stay in the circle you drew for her. She stepped out of it to hold me up. Cha-Young stood, turning to face Angela. He looked at the black woman in the stiff maid's uniform, the outsider who had dismantled a 3-year conspiracy with an open palm and a stubborn heart. He realized then that the most dangerous person in his house wasn't a hitman or a rival boss. It was the woman who had nothing to lose but her integrity. You aren't a maid, Angela Morse, he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. In this city, people pay millions for loyalty that can't be bought. You gave it for free to a woman who had been forgotten. He walked to the obsidian table and pulled out the heavy velvet chair opposite his own. It was a seat reserved for advisors, for family, for the architects of the syndicate. He gestured toward it. The wedding is cancelled. The table is being reset. From now on, you don't answer to the housekeeper. You answer to the matriarch. And when we discuss the future of the Lee family, you will have a seat. Angela looked at the chair, then at Mrs. Kim, who gave a single, commanding nod. Angela walked forward, her heels clicking on the marble with a new, resonant weight. She sat down, her black uniform a stark, beautiful contrast to the white stone. The lion's den hadn't broken her. It had recognized her as one of its own. As the city lights twinkled outside the glass, the three of them sat in the quiet power of the new guard. A house finally becoming a home, built on a foundation of truth and the strong hands of a woman who refused to let go. True power isn't found in the cold marble of a penthouse or the fear a name commands. It is found in the courage to see the invisible. Angela proved that a uniform does not define a soul, and silence is not a sign of weakness. To hold someone up when the world is trying to erase them is the highest form of rebellion. In the end, a house built on shadows will always crumble, but a home built on the strength of hands that refuse to stay idle will endure any storm. Stay dangerous. Stay loved. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments, and as always, sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.